When a human rights lawyer, Aaliyah Hayes, decided to travel discreetly on her brother's airline, Apex Air, owned by black billionaire Darius Hayes, she never anticipated that her journey would throw her into the center of prejudice, contempt, and a sinister plot of sabotage. But Aaliyah was no stranger to adversity. Could she rise above and defend her family's honor? At Zenith International Airport, the scene was a chaotic symphony of intersecting lives and hurried journeys. Announcements droned rhythmically, blending with the rolling of suitcases and the brisk steps of travelers rushing to their destinations. Among the crowd, Aaliyah Hayes moved with quiet poise. She carried a simple suitcase, unbranded and understated, reflecting her intention to avoid attention. However, her modest appearance couldn't obscure her natural confidence. She navigated the security checkpoint with a composed yet unapologetic air, her steps steady and resolute. At the baggage service counter, a long line of tired and impatient travelers shuffled forward. Behind the counter, Leela, a young attendant with a high ponytail of platinum blonde hair, leaned against the desk, engrossed in her phone. Her gaze seemed glued to the screen, as if nothing beyond its glow mattered. When Aaliyah's turn finally arrived, Leela glanced up, her scrutinizing eyes sweeping over Aaliyah from head to toe. Aaliyah's casual attire, worn jeans, a button-down shirt, and scuffed sneakers, did not escape Lila's judgmental gaze. A smirk played on the attendant's lips, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is this really your luggage?" Leela asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm, each word stretched out as if to underline her disdain. Her mocking tone drew the attention of those standing nearby. "First class, huh? Doesn't seem like it." Aaliyah paused, meeting Lila's smug expression with calm, steady eyes. Without a flicker of emotion, she replied evenly, "Yes, it's mine. And yes, I'm flying first class." Leela raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening with a hint of derision. "Oh, really? Are you sure about that? Maybe your ticket has a typo. Just making sure there's no glitch in our system. Nothing personal, of course." Her sneer was anything but subtle. Aaliyah took a deep breath, lifting her brow with calculated precision. Her reply was sharp, yet measured. "There's no mistake with my ticket, but it seems your attitude has ended up in the wrong place." Lila sniffed, flipping her ponytail with exaggerated flair before snatching Aaliyah's suitcase. She shoved it onto the conveyor belt with unnecessary force, the harsh clang drawing winces from Aaliyah and others nearby. "I'm sure Apex Air is thrilled to have such a unique first-class passenger," Lila said coldly, her voice laced with mockery. Aaliyah's gaze lingered on Lila, unyielding, as if studying her every expression. The intensity of Aaliyah's stare unsettled Lila, who quickly turned her attention back to her desk, pretending to fuss with paperwork. "Is Apex Air service always this memorable?" Aaliyah asked, her tone steady but biting with sarcasm. Her sharp eyes bore into Lila as if committing her face to memory. Lila shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Guests always have expectations. I'm just doing my job." A faint smile tugged at Aaliyah's lips, icy and detached. "Let's hope you do it better next time." Lila said nothing, dismissing her with a shake of her head. With composed elegance, Aaliyah turned and walked away, her steps firm and deliberate, even as curious glances followed her. She didn't need an apology. She had long grown used to judgmental stares and veiled condescension. Instead, she carried a quiet resolve, determined to turn today's silence into tomorrow's action. Leaving the baggage counter behind, Aaliyah headed toward the first-class lounge. This area was a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of the main terminal. Plush leather armchairs arranged with precision, soft golden lighting, radiating warmth. Yet, despite the calm exterior, the atmosphere felt heavy with tension. Behind the counter in the lounge, a male attendant in a neatly pressed uniform stood stiffly, his impatience etched into every line of his face. As Aaliyah approached, his eyes flickered over her with barely concealed skepticism, scanning her simple outfit as though searching for a flaw. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his voice laced with careful condescension. "This is the first-class check-in area, you know." Aaliyah didn't respond right away. Reaching into her pocket, she produced her boarding pass with quiet assurance, handing it to him without a word. Her expression remained unreadable as he inspected it, his movements slow and deliberate, as though hoping to uncover an error. "This is a first-class ticket," he admitted reluctantly, his voice subdued and tinged with disbelief. Returning the ticket, he gestured toward Gate 3. "Enjoy your flight." Aliyah inclined her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you. I'm sure it will be an unforgettable experience." As she walked toward the gate, her back straight and her stride purposeful, Aliyah carried not just her luggage, but also a steadfast determination. Little did she know, the challenges awaiting her on this flight would test her resolve and her faith in ways she could never have anticipated. Just as Lila had a moment to check her phone, a vibration startled her. Frowning, she glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, before slipping the phone out and retreating to a dimly lit corner behind the counter. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, revealing an unfamiliar number, a string of digits without a name. Hesitating, Lila's curiosity and unease mingled as she pressed the call button. "Lila," a deep, cold voice spoke, sharp and cutting, making her spine stiffen. Instinctively, her body tensed as if preparing for something unknown. "Who's calling?" she asked, her tone striving for neutrality but betraying a faint tremor. "Who I am doesn't matter," the voice replied, deliberate and measured. Each word seemed drawn out to ensure its weight sunk in. "There's a traitor on today's flight. Pay attention. If you fail, the consequences won't be pleasant." Lila froze, her grip tightening on the phone as her breath quickened. "A traitor? On this flight? Can you be more specific?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silence stretched on the other end, heavy and oppressive. Panic swelled in her chest as seconds dragged by. Finally, the voice returned, lower and more sinister, hissing like venom. "Just watch closely. They're not like the others. Be careful." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lila clutching the silent phone. She stared at the blank screen, willing it to offer answers that wouldn't come. The only sound was the hammering of her own heartbeat and the icy dread creeping up her spine. Emerging from the shadows, she cast a quick glance toward the terminal, where travelers bustled about, oblivious to her unease. Her eyes darted from face to face, scanning with urgency, until they landed on a familiar figure, Aliyah Hayes. Stepping back into the shadows, Lila's phone dimmed in her hand. From her vantage point, she could see Aliyah seated near the boarding gate, unaware of being observed. Aliyah held a small book, her face serene and contemplative under the airport's harsh white lights. The glow softened her features, lending her an air of quiet elegance. But to Lila there was something more, a subtle inscrutability that made her wary. The words from the call echoed in her mind, not like the others. Lila's gaze sharpened, suspicion lighting her eyes. To the untrained observer, Aliyah appeared entirely at peace. Yet from Lila's perspective, an invisible darkness seemed to surround her. An unspoken threat coiled just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. "If something's really going on," Lila muttered to herself, "I'll be the one to catch it." But deep inside, unease simmered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had unwittingly stepped into a game far larger and far more dangerous than she could understand. Apex Air's first-class cabin exuded an air of exclusivity, worlds apart from the chaos of the terminal. Leather seats gleamed under soft lighting, and the atmosphere was hushed, almost reverent. Yet beneath the polished perfection lurked an undercurrent of tension, subtle but undeniable. Aliyah settled into seat 1A with a posture of quiet confidence. The plush leather cradled her form, but she felt no comfort in the luxury. She wasn't here to enjoy the perks. Her presence served a higher purpose. Her gaze swept the cabin, taking in the subtle hostility that lingered. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a sharp black suit leaned toward a well-dressed woman, regaling her with stories of his latest business triumphs. His smugness filled the air like a heavy perfume. In contrast, Aliyah, with her understated attire and reserved demeanor, seemed like an anomaly, an outsider in a world of gleaming privilege. Lila, now clad in her crisp flight attendant uniform, moved through the aisle with calculated precision. Her gaze never strayed far from Aliyah, watching with a scrutiny that felt invasive. Aliyah felt the weight of Lila's stare but refused to react. Her face remained calm, impassive, as her sharp eyes flicked over Lila briefly before turning to the window. Beyond the glass, the endless expanse of blue sky stretched serenely, a stark contrast to the tension simmering within the cabin. She tilted her head, her reflection faintly visible against the cabin lights. Her loose hair framed her unadorned features, which appeared sharper in the soft glow. Closing her eyes momentarily, she tightened her grip on the armrests. Approval from those around her was neither needed nor sought. Yet as much as she tried to ignore it, the undercurrent of judgment pressed against her. An unspoken challenge she had no choice but to confront. Her resolve strengthened as the murmurs of the cabin continued, a distant hum against the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Aaliyah Hayes sat composed in her first-class seat, her practiced indifference a shield against the subtle but persistent prejudice pressing against her like an invisible hand. No fake smiles weighed down with condescension, no judgment cloaked in polite tones, but the hostility was palpable. A short distance away, Lila Langley, now in her polished flight attendant uniform, approached another passenger. Her demeanor transformed, her smile warm and professional, a far cry from the frosty indifference she had shown Aaliyah earlier. The contrast was striking, yet as Lila turned back toward the aisle, her eyes instinctively sought seat 1A again. Suspicion and unease lingered in her expression. Aaliyah's eyes opened slowly, lifting to meet Lila's. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. Lila quickly looked away, but not before Aaliyah's icy intensity bore into her, leaving an unmistakable mark. The silence between them hung heavy, charged with unspoken understanding. Whatever tension existed between the two had grown far beyond the professional dynamic of a flight attendant and a passenger. Lila approached from the back of the cabin, carrying a tray with a single glass of water. Her expression was etched with subtle disdain, her body language radiating a lack of goodwill. As she neared Aaliyah's seat, she paused, her gaze scanning Aaliyah with overt scrutiny, making no effort to hide her judgment. Rolling her eyes with theatrical deliberation, Lila finally placed the glass of water on Aaliyah's table. The act was anything but gentle. The glass landed with a loud thud, its contents sloshing precariously. "Apologies for the delay," Lila said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she stretched each word. Her lips curved into a faint, dismissive smile, but her eyes remained cold and unyielding. "I hope this water isn't too extravagant for your taste. Let's see if it suits you." Aaliyah looked up, her icy gaze locking onto Lila's smug expression. She didn't respond immediately, letting the tension linger in the air. Then, with deliberate precision, she lifted the glass, her motions calm and controlled. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but laced with subtle sarcasm. "Though I believe you may have forgotten to serve the meal. Or must I remind you of that too?" Lila raised an eyebrow, unease flickering across her face before she masked it with a quick recovery. "Oh really?" she replied, her voice rising slightly as if to reassert dominance. "I wasn't aware first-class passengers had their own schedules, but if you insist, I'll reconsider how best to serve you." Aaliyah's faint smile was almost imperceptible, but her gaze remained unwavering. "I don't think punctual service is too much to expect in first class," she said, her tone as cool as steel. "But perhaps you feel differently." Lila faltered, irritation flashing in her eyes before she regained her composure. After a tense pause, she nodded curtly. "I'll check on that right away, ma'am," she said, emphasizing the last word with a mocking edge. She turned and walked away, casting a pointed glance over her shoulder as if committing Aaliyah to memory. Moments later, Lila's demeanor transformed entirely as she addressed another passenger, her voice warm and polished. "Your red wine, sir. I hope you enjoy the flight. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to call on me." Aaliyah sat upright, her gaze fixed on Lila's back. Her expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened on the armrests, a subtle sign that her patience was fraying. When Lila stole another glance over her shoulder, Aaliyah let a flicker of irritation show, an unmistakable signal that the game had gone too far. Lila's lips curled into a tight, uncomfortable smirk, but she didn't respond. Instead, she walked away, leaving a tension behind so palpable it seemed to vibrate in the air. The tranquil atmosphere of the first-class cabin shattered abruptly as a piercing alert sounded. The soft, intermittent ping from the aircraft system grew louder and more insistent, cutting through the fragile calm like an alarm in the dead of night. Passengers stirred uneasily in their seats, their whispered conversations swelling into a hum of anxious murmurs. The cabin lights, once steady and warm, flickered erratically, sometimes flaring brightly, other times dimming to near darkness, as though the plane itself were under duress. The intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice struggling to maintain composure. Ladies and gentlemen, the aircraft's communication system is experiencing a malfunction. The crew is addressing the issue. Please remain calm. Nervous murmurs filled the cabin. Some passengers clasped their hands together in silent prayer, their lips moving in whispered pleas. Aaliyah sat upright, her sharp gaze scanning the cabin with precision. She noted every movement, every expression. A few seats away, an elderly man clutched a rosary, his trembling lips mouthing inaudible supplications. "Dear God, keep us safe," he whispered, his voice cracking. The tension was thick, the air heavy with uncertainty, but Aliyah's resolve didn't waver. While others succumbed to fear, she remained focused, her sharp eyes fixed on the shifting dynamics around her. Something was amiss, and she intended to uncover it. The cabin crew moved briskly, their shoes tapping a tense rhythm against the floor. Their forced composure barely masked the tension gripping the plane. Aaliyah Hayes tightened her grip on the cold metal armrest, her outward calm concealing the growing certainty in her mind. This was no ordinary malfunction. Something was wrong. From the rear of the cabin, Lila Langley appeared, her pristine uniform an ironic contrast to her strained demeanor. At first, her movements seemed aimless, but with a sudden shift of intent, she marched directly toward Aaliyah's seat. Gone was the thin veneer of disdain. In its place was a potent mixture of suspicion and unease. Stopping before Aaliyah, Lila clutched her service tray tightly, her knuckles whitening. Her voice, low and steely, cut through the murmurs of the cabin. "Who are you really?" she demanded, her tone trembling with barely restrained accusation. "And why does it feel like everything started going wrong the moment you boarded this plane?" Nearby passengers turned to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and mounting dread. A woman murmured under her breath, "Oh Lord, what's happening?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering despite the weight of Lila's words. She let the silence stretch, asserting control over the interaction before responding. Her voice was calm but carried a quiet authority. "I'm just a passenger," she replied. "Perhaps you should focus on doing your job instead of crafting conspiracy theories." Lila hesitated, her confidence faltering for a moment before she rallied. "Ordinary passengers don't trigger system malfunctions," she shot back, her voice taut with frustration and fear. Aaliyah met her gaze unflinchingly, her dark eyes sharp and unyielding. "If you believe in God," she said, her tone cool and measured, "perhaps you should pray more and speculate less. The only thing I've done is sit here, waiting for you to do your job." Lila's grip on the tray tightened, her knuckles pale. She didn't respond, but her composure wavered. Another flight attendant approached, her expression firm but concerned, and gently guided Lila away. They exchanged hushed words, and Lila cast one last accusatory glance at Aaliyah before retreating. Her steps were stiff, her tension obvious. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her icy gaze shifting to the window. Outside, the sky remained an endless expanse of serene blue, seemingly ordained by a higher power. Yet inside the cabin, chaos simmered just below the surface. Each passenger seemed trapped in their own silent trial, a test of patience, faith, or resolve. Across the aisle, Reed Thatcher reclined in his seat, his perfectly tailored suit and polished demeanor radiating self-importance. The gold watch on his wrist gleamed under the flickering cabin lights, a subtle testament to his wealth and success. His gaze settled on Aaliyah, the modestly dressed woman seated a few rows away. A sneer twisted his lips as he spoke, his deep voice dripping with mockery. "It's truly baffling," Reed began, his words slicing through the cabin's tense quiet. A few passengers turned their heads toward him. What was Apex Air thinking, allowing someone like her to sit here? Charity work, perhaps? His dry chuckle was sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. "I hope this is a one-time occurrence. Preferential treatment for cases like this does nothing but hold society back." Aaliyah slowly lifted her gaze from the book she had been reading, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She set the book down on the small table beside her, her calm yet icy precision drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "You mentioned God, didn't you?" Aaliyah's voice cut through the tense atmosphere, measured and steady. Her words carried a clarity that made every syllable unmistakable. "If you truly believe in Him, you'd know we're all created in His image, myself included. And yes, even you." Reed faltered for a moment, disbelief flickering across his face at her audacity. "Are you trying to lecture me about faith?" he scoffed. "I've seen too many people hide behind God's name to excuse their inadequacy." Aaliyah held his gaze unwaveringly, her voice now edged with steel. "I'm not lecturing anyone," she replied, her tone unyielding. "But the words you just spoke don't only insult me, they contradict the very principles God teaches. If you find that offensive, perhaps you should ask yourself why." The cabin's atmosphere turned glacial. A woman nearby clasped her hands, murmuring a quiet prayer under her breath. An older man seated next to Reed cleared his throat awkwardly, as if trying to dispel the tension. Reed's face flushed a deep red, but his pride refused to let him retreat. "You think you can preach to me while sitting there so clearly out of place?" he spat, his tone venomous. "Absurd. If God were here, I'm certain he'd agree that people like you, who contribute nothing of value, don't deserve special treatment." Aaliyah's lips curled into a faint smile, her confidence unshaken. "If God were here," she said deliberately, her voice calm yet cutting, "he would remind you that a person's worth isn't measured by wealth or status, but by how they treat others. If you think he'd stand with you, then perhaps you don't understand him as well as you claim." A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin. Confusion gave way to quiet admiration, and a middle-aged man whispered under his breath, "She's right. Bless her." Reed turned away abruptly, his lips pressed tightly together. Fury burned in his eyes, but he refused to acknowledge her further. Aaliyah, as if unaffected, picked up her book and reopened it to the page she had been reading. Yet in her gaze lingered a flicker of defiance, a quiet resolve declaring that no one would diminish her, least of all those who believed themselves untouchable. Aaliyah Hayes's words hung in the air, deliberate and clear. "A person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or status, but by how they treat others. And if you think God would stand with you, perhaps you don't truly understand him." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Murmurs rippled through the passengers, confusion giving way to quiet admiration. A middle-aged man near the aisle muttered, "She's right. Bless her." Across the aisle, Reed Thatcher turned away sharply, his lips pressed into a tight line. Fury burned in his eyes, but he refused to respond, knowing he had lost this exchange. Aaliyah, outwardly unaffected, picked up her book and reopened it to the page she had been reading. Her gaze was steady, but the faint flicker of defiance in her expression declared that she would not allow anyone to belittle her, especially those who cloaked arrogance in wealth. The sky outside darkened, blending with the creeping shadows in Aaliyah's mind. A sense of unease grew, inching into certainty. Something was wrong. Her brow furrowed slightly, and her deep brown eyes hardened with resolve. "Something's not right," she murmured under her breath, the words barely audible even to herself. She couldn't sit idly by. Whatever was happening on this flight was no coincidence, and she silently vowed to uncover the truth. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from the cold window, sealing her silent pact with herself. The first-class cabin of Apex Air was bathed in a soft golden glow, its luxurious atmosphere an illusion of calm. Aaliyah sat motionless, her eyes seemingly fixed on the book in her lap. In truth, she was observing everyone around her, her gaze sweeping over each passenger and crew member. Her intuition nagged at her. Something hidden lingered beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. Her sharp eyes landed on Lila Langley at the back of the cabin. The flight attendant leaned close to Reed Thatcher, whispering something inaudible. The dim light caught the sharp lines of Lila's face, her expression unusually intense. Reed lounged in his seat with the air of a man completely at ease. Yet, when he nodded subtly in response to Lila, his gaze flickered toward Aaliyah for the briefest of moments. The look was fleeting, but enough to carry a glint of suspicion, or calculation. Aaliyah's brow tightened, unease curling in her chest. "God help me," she thought, her sharp gaze following their movements. "They're sharing something, a secret I'm not meant to know. But it's connected to whatever's happening on this flight." She lowered her book, placing it carefully on the table. Her fingers drummed against the smooth surface, a subconscious rhythm to channel her mounting tension. At that moment, Lila's eyes darted toward her. The glance was quick but piercing, like the edge of a blade. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She met Lila's sharp gaze head-on, unyielding. Silently, she resolved, If this is truly a test of faith, I will not falter. Truth belongs to those who have the patience to seek it. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, her nails pressing into her palms hard enough to sting. But the pain was grounding, sharpening her focus. She cast a fleeting glance toward the window, where the endless night sky stretched into infinity, broken only by the faint blinking of the plane's wing lights. The faint reflection of her face in the glass reminded her of her belief. God is watching, waiting for me to act with purpose and faith. Not yet, she told herself, inhaling deeply to steady her nerves. Watch a little longer. Understand before you move. Her gaze shifted back to Lila and Reed. Lila leaned in to whisper something again, and Reed's gaze flicked toward her seat, his expression unreadable. They're hiding something, Aaliyah thought, her eyes narrowing. This can't be a coincidence. She nodded subtly to herself as if affirming an unspoken decision. If this trial is from God, I'll face it head on. The truth cannot stay hidden forever. His light will reveal all. The rest of the passengers remained blissfully unaware, lost in their own worlds, or enjoying the luxury of first class. But Aaliyah knew better. The situation was far from ordinary, and even if the exact threat eluded her, she could feel its escalation like a storm brewing on the horizon. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her fingers relaxing against the tabletop. Lord, she prayed silently, if this is the time for me to act, guide me. If not, grant me the patience to wait for the right moment. Picking up her book again, she let her gaze fall back to the printed words. But her mind remained alert, her attention fixed on her surroundings. Through the corner of her eye, she observed every subtle movement, every whispered exchange, holding firm in her faith that darkness would never prevail. The cabin lights flickered erratically, as if an invisible storm swept through the plane. The illusion of calm shattered when the sharp, incessant beep of the alarm pierced the air. Passengers jolted, their fragile sense of security torn apart. The aircraft shuddered violently, as though gripped by an unseen hand. Screams erupted, chaos spilling into the confined space. "Dear God, save us," a woman nearby cried, her trembling hands clasped in desperate prayer. Aaliyah sat rigid in her seat, her sharp gaze scanning the cabin as chaos unfolded around her. Her heart raced, but her composure held firm. She focused on the flight crew as they moved hastily, their strained movements betraying their mounting anxiety. An elderly man nearby clutched a rosary, his trembling lips moving in silent supplication. "Dear Lord, keep us safe," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Amid the cries and prayers, Aaliyah remained silent, her determination hardening. This is no ordinary malfunction, she thought, her sharp eyes narrowing. Whatever this is, I need to be ready. Her mind churned with possibilities, but her faith anchored her. Lord, if this is the test you've chosen for me, I will not falter. Passengers clung to their seats, murmuring desperate prayers amidst the chaos. A man gripped his armrests tightly, his trembling voice spilling out a rapid plea. "Oh Lord, don't let this be my last journey." Aaliyah Hayes sat still, her hands lightly gripping the armrests as the plane jolted and shuddered again. Her heart raced, but her face remained composed, her sharp gaze sweeping over the cabin. She focused on the crew, who were frantically trying to calm the passengers, their movements betraying the mounting tension. Her eyes landed on Lila Langley, who stood near the first-class doorway. Unlike her colleagues, Lila wasn't engaging with passengers. Instead, she leaned in close, whispering something to Reed Thatcher. Reed reclined in his seat, eerily serene despite the danger. His unsettling calm clashed with the panic around him. She knows something, Aaliyah thought, her gaze narrowing. While others succumbed to fear and whispered desperate invocations, Lila and Reed seemed absorbed in a secret. Aaliyah inhaled deeply, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. But why aren't they panicking? What are they hiding? The intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice struggling to maintain control amidst the roaring engines. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions." The announcement sent fresh waves of sobs and shouts rippling through the cabin. "Lord, please deliver us safely," a man cried, his voice rising above the din. "Protect us, Lord," whispered a woman, clutching her rosary with trembling hands. Aaliyah scanned the cabin again, noting that not everyone was overtaken by hysteria. Lila moved deliberately, her gaze sharp and calculating. She wasn't rushing to reassure passengers, nor did she exhibit the same frantic urgency as her colleagues. Instead, she seemed to be observing, watching. When Lila's eyes met Alea's, it wasn't the look of a flight attendant tending to her duties. It was the assessing stare of someone probing for a weakness, evaluating a potential threat. Alea held Lila's gaze, steady and unwavering. Her eyes brimmed with quiet strength, fortified by an unshakable faith. If this is the test God has chosen for me, I will face it. And if she's hiding something, I will uncover it. Lila's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile before she turned and walked away. Alea's eyes stayed fixed on Lila's retreating figure, her mind piecing together fragments of a puzzle cloaked in doubt. "What are you doing, Lila? And why is Reed so disturbingly calm?" The plane jolted violently, sending drink trays clattering from the hands of a flight attendant. Alea tightened her grip on the armrest, but kept her focus sharp, her gaze locked on the curtain where Lila had disappeared. Closing her eyes for a moment, she whispered a silent prayer. "Lord, if this is your will, guide me. I will not falter." The night sky stretched in impenetrable darkness beyond the plane's windows, devoid of light. Yet within Alea, a faint glow of faith burned steadily, urging her forward. Something isn't right, she thought again, opening her eyes with renewed determination. "And I will not let the darkness obscure your light." The warm glow of the cabin lights pulsed faintly as Alea rose from her seat. Moving silently toward the back, she was drawn by the low murmurs emanating from behind the dividing curtain. Her breath stilled as she edged closer, fragments of a conversation reaching her ears. "Make sure it looks like a technical malfunction," came Reed's deep, calculating voice. "Apex Air will never recover from this. It'll be ours." "Understood," Lila replied, her voice quick and urgent. "I'll finish my part. Just make sure you keep your promise." Alea froze, her heart pounding. Peering through the slight opening in the curtain, she saw Lila standing close to Reed, her grip tight around her phone, tension etched across her face. Reed, in stark contrast, exuded an unsettling calm, the demeanor of a man confident in his plan's success. "They're conspiring," Alea realized, her fists clenching so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They're trying to bring down Apex Air. And Darius, my brother, is their target." She stepped back, her mind racing with anger and betrayal. But why? What do they gain from this? Returning to her seat, Alea fixed her steely gaze on the window. The darkness outside mirrored the turmoil within her. A foreboding danger was slowly coming into focus. Suddenly, a bright flashlight beam cut through the cabin, startling passengers. Two air marshals entered with purposeful strides, their uniforms crisp, their expressions grave. One of them spoke, his voice sharp and commanding as it echoed through the tense cabin. "We confirm this is Alea Hayes, sister of Darius Hayes, owner of Apex Air." The first-class cabin froze, a stunned silence descending like a heavy curtain. Lila halted mid-step, her eyes widening with shock and dread. "Who are you really?" Lila Langley blurted, her voice breaking with tension as her composure cracked. Reed Thatcher arched an eyebrow, a dangerous smirk spreading across his face before it vanished, replaced by a mask of calculated alarm. Pointing directly at Alea Hayes, he declared with theatrical indignation, "She's the saboteur. This is her plan to bring down Apex Air from the inside." Alea rose slowly from her seat, her spine straight and her expression unwavering, even as the glare of flashlights bore down on her. Her voice was cold and sharp, cutting through the chaos with undeniable authority. "I am not someone you can intimidate," she said, her tone as unyielding as steel. Her gaze swept over Lila and Reed, piercing and resolute. Reed stepped forward, his tone persuasive and dripping with feigned righteousness. "She's been using her brother's name to shield her sabotage. This is all a ploy to weaken Apex Air. I warned everyone about her from the beginning. She's been suspicious this entire time." Lila quickly added, her voice strained as she struggled to maintain her composure. "Exactly. I knew something was off the moment she boarded. Look at her, always watching, observing, taking notes. She's been planning this." Alea crossed her arms, her lips curling into a faint, deliberate smile. "It's always the loudest voices that reveal the guilty," she said, her words sharp and cutting. "I hope you're prepared to face the consequences of your lies because the truth will come to light." Lila faltered, her confidence crumbling, as she took a hesitant step back. Her face turned pale, her darting eyes betraying her growing panic. Reed, however, surged forward, his eyes blazing with desperation. "Truth?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Who are you to speak of truth?" Aaliyah remained silent, her gaze steady and unyielding as it bore into Reed, dismantling his every facade. Her expression radiated strength, while her unwavering eyes reflected unrelenting determination. Around her, whispers rippled through the passengers, murmurs of doubt, curiosity, and suspicion swirling like an undercurrent. But Aaliyah paid them no mind. The measured footsteps of the air marshals echoed behind her, but she stood firm, her composure unshaken. "Lord," she prayed silently, "if this is your test, I will not falter. I will fight for truth, for justice, and for what I believe is right." Lila and Reed stood frozen in the background, confusion and fear etched into their faces. But Aaliyah didn't look back. She stepped forward, her head held high, as if declaring to the world, "This is far from over." The darkness of the airport loomed beyond the plane's windows, wrapping the aircraft in its shadow. But in Aaliyah's eyes burned a fierce light of faith and determination. "God is always on the side of justice," she reminded herself, "and I will not let these liars win." The meeting room was stark and stifling, its pale gray walls devoid of warmth. A large conference table dominated the space, surrounded by Apex Air shareholders, members of the flight crew, and security personnel stationed at the corners like silent sentinels. Tension hung thick in the air, suffocating and oppressive. Aaliyah sat at one end of the table, her hands resting lightly on the cold wooden surface. Outwardly composed, she felt the weight of suspicion pressing down on her with every measured breath. Every glance in the room, even those that avoided her, seemed laden with unspoken judgment. Her sharp eyes swept over the room, carefully gauging the atmosphere. The shareholders, impeccably dressed, exchanged fleeting glances, their sharp, unreadable expressions silently questioning, "Who is she really? And why is she here?" In a far corner, Lila and Reed stood close together, their silence betraying everything. Lila's hands were tightly clenched, her face straining to maintain a mask of composure. But the darting glances and incessant smoothing of her uniform hem revealed her unease. Reed, in stark contrast, exuded smug confidence. He stood tall, the air of a man convinced of his impending victory radiating from him. Aaliyah remained poised, though her mind churned with turbulent thoughts. "Lord, you are testing me," she prayed silently, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "I cannot let their doubt unsettle me. Truth always aligns with justice, and I trust you to guide me through this moment." She closed her eyes briefly, her hand gripping the cool metal of the pen in front of her, a grounding presence in the chaos. When she opened her eyes, her resolve was clear. "They may question me, but it doesn't matter. Once the truth comes to light, no one can keep it hidden from your gaze." Her posture remained upright, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I didn't come here to be intimidated. I came to expose their lies." The room was steeped in heavy silence, the air thick with unease. Reed reclined in his chair, his demeanor smug and confident. When the silence became almost unbearable, he rose slowly, adjusting the lapel of his suit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reed began, his assured voice slicing through the stillness, "Apex Air has been rotting from the inside for years. I have simply done what was necessary to repair a failing system." His gaze swept the room, calculating and deliberate. "Darius Hayes," he continued, "the man you've all placed your trust in, is the root of this chaos. He's out of his depth, and I've stepped in to prevent further collapse." He paused, his lips curling into a cold smile. "I'm not the cause of instability. I'm merely expediting the inevitable." He gestured subtly toward Lila. "Many, like Miss Langley here, have long understood that Apex Air needs a complete overhaul. And I am the only one capable of making that happen." Lila shifted uneasily beside him, her hands gripping her jacket tightly. Her pale face betrayed her discomfort, but Reed pressed on, undeterred. "And you, Miss Hayes," Reed said, turning his sharp gaze to Aaliyah, a mocking lilt in his voice, "perhaps you've simply found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. A costly mistake." The tension in the room grew thick, all eyes darting between Reed and Aaliyah, awaiting her response. Reed Thatcher paced slowly at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the Apex Air shareholders with the precision of a predator sizing up its prey. His cold smile curled at the edges of his lips as he continued, his voice calm and calculated. "I am not the cause of Apex Air's instability," he declared. "I am merely expediting the inevitable. This airline is in freefall, and it needs a complete overhaul. Only I am capable of delivering it." He gestured toward Lila Langley, who stood silently in the corner, her head bowed. "Miss Langley and others have known this for a long time. They understand that Apex Air can't survive under its current leadership." Lila shifted uneasily, her discomfort plain on her face. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair as if searching for an anchor. Reed paid her no mind and turned his sharp, cutting gaze toward Aaliyah Hayes. A mocking smirk played on his lips as he spoke, dragging out her name with cruel deliberation. "And you, Miss Hayes," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "perhaps you found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. A costly misstep." The room erupted with murmurs. An elderly shareholder near Aaliyah gasped, clutching the table for support. "You planned this all along," he rasped, his voice quivering with disbelief. A younger shareholder leaned toward her neighbor, whispering urgently, her wide eyes filled with shock. "He orchestrated all of this just to take control?" The murmurs swelled into a growing wave of alarm and outrage among the shareholders and crew. Yet Reed stood unbothered, his faint smile betraying his sense of triumph. Lila, still standing in the corner, kept her head bowed. Her trembling hands gripped the back of her chair. But Aaliyah saw through her mask. Lila was barely holding herself together, her anxiety simmering just below the surface. Aaliyah, motionless in her seat, kept her piercing gaze locked on Reed, her expression cold and unreadable. Inside, anger roared like a firestorm, but she forced herself to stay calm. "He's steering this exactly where he wants," she thought, her eyes glinting with determination. "But I won't let him win." She exhaled slowly, her sharp eyes sweeping the room. Doubt and confusion were etched on the faces around her, flickers of fear and hesitation evident in every glance. But Aaliyah knew that once the truth came to light, Reed's carefully constructed facade would crumble. Tightening her grip on the armrest, she braced herself. "Lord," she prayed silently, "grant me the strength to reveal the truth and defend what is right." Reed's gaze flicked back to Aaliyah, but this time he hesitated. For a brief moment she saw a crack in his confidence, a glimmer of uncertainty. Aaliyah seized on it, knowing she had a chance to turn the tide. The heavy silence was shattered as the meeting room door swung open. Darius Hayes strode in, his tall frame and commanding presence instantly dominating the space. The murmurs died away, replaced by the sharp echo of his footsteps on the cold marble floor. He stopped at the head of the table, his deep brown eyes scanning the room with calculated intensity. His gaze lingered on the uneasy shareholders, passed over Reed with a flicker of disdain, and finally settled on Aaliyah. His expression hardened, a mixture of severity and scrutiny etched into his features. The room seemed to freeze, the weight of his presence pressing down on everyone. "Darius," Reed began, breaking the silence with a voice smooth but tinged with mockery, "I trust you'll explain why your sister is here, in the midst of a crisis like this. Her name keeps appearing in the latest reports." Darius didn't answer immediately. His unblinking gaze remained fixed on Aaliyah. Seconds passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, his voice, low and sharp like the edge of a blade, broke the tension. "Aaliyah," he said, his tone measured, "why are you here? And why is your name tied to this situation?" Aaliyah sat upright, her hands steadying her against the table. Her usually piercing gaze flickered with a hint of hurt. The question carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Darius doubted her, and that doubt pierced her heart like a dagger. "You think I'm with them?" she asked, her voice firm and deliberate. Each word was carefully chosen, revealing none of the pain she felt inside. "I came back for you, Darius, for Apex Air, to help you protect everything we've built." Darius's expression remained impassive, his eyes locked on hers. "And yet," he said slowly, "everything that happened on that flight, every incident, every rumor, points to you being more than just an ordinary passenger. Can you explain that?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, disbelief flashing across her face. She drew a deep breath, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "You've never trusted me, have you?" she asked, her words soft yet sharp. "What have I done to make you think I'd betray you? Why does every explanation I give fall on deaf ears?" For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered in Darius's gaze, breaking through his composed demeanor. but the shadow of doubt lingered. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm, "this isn't personal. It's about Apex Air, thousands of employees, millions of passengers. I can't rely on faith alone." "Then look at the facts," Aaliyah countered, her eyes blazing with determination. "Reed and Lila are conspiring against you. I've heard their plans, seen their moves, and yet instead of trusting me, you choose to trust those who are already trying to destroy Apex Air." She paused, her gaze holding his. Her voice softened, layered with raw emotion. "If you can't trust me," she said, "then at least trust your own instincts. Look at everything with your own eyes. God stands with the truth, Darius, and so do I." The room hung heavy with tension as Aaliyah Hayes finished speaking, her voice steady yet layered with emotion. "If you can't trust me," she said, holding Darius Hayes's gaze, "then at least trust your own instincts. Look at everything with your own eyes. God stands with the truth, Darius, and so do I." The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to interrupt the taut exchange between the siblings. Lila Langley sat with her head bowed, gripping the edge of her chair as if it was the only thing grounding her. Meanwhile, Reed Thatcher stood with his arms crossed, his smirk unwavering, but his eyes betrayed something else: calculation. Darius exhaled deeply, the sharpness in his expression softening ever so slightly. Still, doubt lingered in his voice as he spoke. "Aaliyah," he began, quieter now, "I don't want to believe you've done anything wrong, but if you want me to stand by you, you'll need to show me proof, actual proof, not just words." Aaliyah clenched her hands, her resolve hardening. "I will show you, Darius," she replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "Not because I need your approval, but because the truth cannot be hidden." She held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes blazing with determination. "I believe in justice, in truth, and in God, and I will fight for all of those, no matter where you choose to stand." Darius stood motionless at the head of the conference table, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the entire airline and his fractured trust. His gaze darted away, unable to meet Aaliyah's unrelenting eyes, which burned with the desperate need for him to understand. "Aaliyah," he said heavily, each word dragged from the depths of his being, "you had a chance to stand beside me, to help me hold Apex Air together. But you turned it down. You chose your own path." He sighed, his eyes drifting toward the window, avoiding her piercing stare. "You don't understand," he said, his voice thick with frustration and pain. "You don't understand what I've fought to keep this company afloat, what our family has staked on this." Aaliyah bit her lip, a sharp ache stabbing her heart like a needle. "And because I wanted to find my own way, you think I don't deserve your trust?" she asked, her voice trembling, though she fought to maintain her composure. Darius turned back to her, his eyes a mix of torment and reproach. "Sometimes I wonder if you even understand how much Apex Air matters. Do you even care?" His words hit Aaliyah like a blow, visceral and raw. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms to keep the tears at bay. "Dear God," she thought silently, "if this is my trial, grant me the strength to endure. I need your strength to go on." Aaliyah rose to her feet, her movements sharp and resolute, as if refusing to let the pain dictate her actions. Her hurt transformed into a fierce determination that shone through her expression. "It's fine if you don't believe in me," she said, her voice steady yet ringing with defiance. "But I will prove myself, not just to you, but to everyone in this room." She swept her gaze across the table, taking in the shareholders and crew members whose uncertain eyes now locked on hers. Her tone demanded their attention, her conviction impossible to ignore. Then she turned back to Darius, her eyes sharp as blades but shadowed with a quiet, unspoken sorrow. "I don't need your forgiveness right now," she continued, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "But I won't let you believe that I don't care. Apex Air is family, and for family, I'll fight to the very end." Without waiting for a reply, Aaliyah turned and walked out of the conference room. The steady echo of her heels against the tiled floor filled the oppressive silence she left behind. The hallway light spilled across her face, highlighting the fierce determination burning in her eyes. Each step she took carried a silent vow. "I will fight, Lord, and I won't let anyone extinguish the truth you've revealed." Darius remained rooted in place, the faint glow of the overhead lights unable to mask the turmoil etched into his features. He watched his sister's figure fade into the distance, his heart a storm of doubt, anger, and unspoken pain. As Aaliyah disappeared, the room seemed darker, as though her unwavering resolve had carried all the light with her. The battle ahead was no longer just for Apex Air. It was for the fractured trust between the siblings, a family torn between betrayal and redemption. A week later, the conference room was ablaze with stark white light, the overhead fixtures reflecting sharply off the polished glass table. All eyes turned to the door as Aaliyah entered, walking with quiet confidence. The echo of her heels against the cold tiled floor resonated with purpose. In her hands was a neatly arranged stack of documents, each page brimming with undeniable truth. She stopped at the head of the table, her presence commanding the room's attention. With deliberate authority, she placed the file down on the table, the thud breaking the tense silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm and clear as she swept her gaze across the room. Her eyes locked briefly with each person, daring them to doubt her. "I have gathered proof," she said, her tone unrelenting. "Proof of the conspiracy against Apex Air, proof of Reed Thatcher's schemes, and proof that everything I've told you was the truth." Her words, deliberate and powerful, marked the beginning of a reckoning. Aaliyah Hayes stood tall, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I have gathered enough evidence to prove that Reed Thatcher and Lila Langley orchestrated the recent disruptions to destabilize Apex Air," she began, her words sharp and deliberate. "These incidents were no coincidence. They were the product of a meticulously planned conspiracy." Her unwavering gaze swept across the room as the shareholders collectively leaned forward, pulled in by the intensity of her tone, despite their unease. Aaliyah opened the file in her hands, flipping to a specific page before sliding it to the center of the table. "Here," she said, "is a copy of email correspondence between Reed and Lila. Mr. Thatcher explicitly instructed Ms. Langley to fabricate technical malfunctions to undermine Apex Air." She paused for effect, her voice firm. "These details have been verified by our internal IT team." Near the end of the table, Reed abruptly shot to his feet, the screech of his chair punctuating his outburst. "This is preposterous," he barked, his voice strained and stripped of its usual composure. "There's no proof I was involved. This is all a misunderstanding." His eyes darted around the room, desperate for support, but the weary and disgusted expressions of the board members offered him none. Beads of sweat formed on his brow as his hands gripped the back of his chair, knuckles white with suppressed panic. Unfazed, Aaliyah flipped to another page and handed it to Darius Hayes, seated at the table's head. "This," she continued, "is a financial report tied to Mr. Thatcher's investment accounts. It shows suspicious transfers made during the time of the recent incidents. Coincidentally, these funds are directly linked to the fabricated disruptions on the last flight." Her gaze fixed on Reed, sharp and unyielding. "Do you deny this?" "Numbers don't lie, Mr. Thatcher," Reed stammered, struggling to regain his composure. You don't understand the situation," he said, his voice trembling. "I did what I had to do to protect Apex Air. I was saving this company from Darius's incompetent leadership." "Protecting Apex Air?" Aaliyah interjected, her voice icy yet commanding. "By sabotaging it? By framing my brother? By using Lila as a pawn to execute your plans? Is that what you call protection, Mr. Thatcher?" She turned to the board members, her eyes burning with conviction. "You placed your trust in someone like him, someone willing to destroy Apex Air for personal gain. But today the truth comes to light, and Apex Air will be restored to those who truly value it." Reed's shoulders sagged as the room's collective gaze bore down on him. His face drained of color, and any trace of smugness vanished. Lila sat frozen, her hands gripping her chair as though clinging to the last vestige of denial. Her wide, fearful eyes darted between Aaliyah and the incriminating documents. Darius, who had remained silent throughout, finally picked up the papers. As his eyes scanned the damning evidence, his expression darkened. When he looked up, his gaze met Aaliyah's, and within it, she saw a mixture of gratitude and regret. Aaliyah stepped back, drawing a steady breath. Her face remained calm and resolute despite the strain etched into her features. The light from above cast a glow over her determined expression, emphasizing her unwavering strength. Though the room buzzed with murmurs and the restless energy of revelation, Aaliyah allowed the evidence and her words to speak for themselves. Lord, she prayed silently, if this is what you ask of me, I will not falter. Truth will prevail, and I will fight for it. Darius sat motionless at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on his sister as she methodically laid out her case. Each word she spoke was like an arrow, piercing through Reed's carefully constructed lies and exposing the truth for all to see. A flicker of astonishment crossed Darius's face as he watched her. For so long, he had doubted her, believed she lacked the strength to stand beside him and protect Apex Air. But now, that image of her had been shattered, replaced by something entirely new. When Aaliyah set the final dossier on the table, the room plunged into heavy silence. All eyes turned to her, though Darius's gaze lingered the longest. He looked at her as though truly seeing her for the first time. A deep sigh escaped him, his voice soft but laden with emotion as he broke the quiet. I was wrong, he said, regret swelling in his words. I didn't believe in you, Aaliyah. Aaliyah turned to face him, her eyes gentler now as they met his sincere gaze. She said nothing, only nodding quietly, as though silently granting the forgiveness he sought. Darius rose from his seat and walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps the only interruption in the hushed room. When he stopped in front of her, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with respect and gratitude. Apex Air needs a leader like you, he said, his deep voice resonating with heartfelt sincerity. You've proven not just your competence, but your character. These are the qualities we need to guide us through this storm. I trust you, Aaliyah. Aaliyah looked back at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. In that moment, she was no longer just his sister, she was his equal. I won't let you down, she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. A rare smile broke through Darius's composed exterior, a quiet but profound gesture from a man accustomed to bearing the weight of responsibility alone. In that moment, Aaliyah Hayes was no longer just Darius Hayes' younger sister. She stood as his equal, a partner ready to help him navigate the challenges ahead. Taking a steady breath, she held back her emotions and replied with unwavering conviction, I won't let you down. Darius's rare smile broke through, quiet yet profound, a gesture from a man long accustomed to bearing the weight of responsibility alone. He took a step back, looking at Aaliyah as if he were finally handing her all the faith he had once withheld. The tense atmosphere in the conference room grew heavier as the sharp echo of police footsteps filled the hallway. Moments later, two uniformed officers stepped inside, their stern gazes scanning the room before locking onto Reed Thatcher and Lila Langley. Reed Thatcher and Lila Langley, one officer announced, his voice cold and precise, like a final verdict. You are under arrest for conspiracy to sabotage Apex Air. Please come with us. Reed leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. His sharp eyes locked onto Aaliyah as he sneered. Impressive, Aaliyah, but let's see how long you can hold on to this company. Playing the hero is never as easy as it looks. Lila, in stark contrast, kept her head bowed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Her trembling hands shook as the cuffs snapped around her wrists. Her unsteady steps reflected the crushing weight of the scornful stares that followed her as she was escorted out. As the two were removed, silence settled over the room. The board members exchanged glances, their eyes shifting between Reed's vacated chair and Aaliyah, who now stood tall at the head of the table. Though no words were spoken, admiration and trust shone clearly in their expressions. Later, Aaliyah sat at her desk, a list of employees implicated in Reed's scheme neatly laid out before her. Her fingers tapped lightly on the surface as her eyes traced each name. She knew that the decisions she made now would define Apex Air's future culture. Looking up, she addressed Darius and the board members gathered around her. Apex Air needs more than justice, she began, her voice steady yet resolute. It needs compassion. Her gaze softened as she continued. These individuals have admitted their mistakes and are willing to make amends. I believe everyone deserves a second chance. She set her pen down, her eyes shining with conviction. They'll remain employed, but only under the condition that they fully participate in cultural reform programs and prove their loyalty through action. Darius nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. A brave decision, he said, his deep voice tinged with approval. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation as lights from dozens of cameras illuminated the space. Aaliyah stood firm behind the podium, her posture exuding confidence and determination. Rows of journalists, shareholders, and Apex Air employees sat before her, their attention fixed on their new leader. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aaliyah began, her voice clear and commanding, yet laced with inspiration, "Apex Air will no longer be just an airline. We will be a symbol of respect, fairness, and transparency." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The mistakes of our past will not be forgotten," she continued. "Instead, they will serve as lessons to propel us forward, stronger than ever." Her gaze swept the crowd, meeting the eyes of each person as she declared, "We commit to comprehensive reform. From corporate culture to service quality, this is not merely a promise but a responsibility. A new journey begins today, and we will not walk it alone. Apex Air will rise alongside all of you as a standard of integrity and compassion." At the back of the hall, Darius stood silently, his gaze never leaving Aaliyah. Pride glimmered in his eyes as he watched his sister take command. When she finished her speech and bowed slightly in gratitude, he nodded as if silently affirming, "She's done it." The applause erupted into a thunderous ovation that filled the room. Some members of the audience rose to their feet, clapping with fervor as if proclaiming their absolute support. Aaliyah looked out over the crowd, drawing strength from their cheers. Though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, a confident smile graced her lips, the smile of someone who had conquered it all. Outside, a newly designed Apex Air aircraft soared from the runway, leaving a white contrail against the deep blue sky. The rising sun bathed the heavens in soft amber hues, illuminating the dawn of a new era. Standing by the window of her office, Aaliyah watched the plane ascend. Determination and hope gleamed in her eyes as she reflected on the journey she had undertaken. "Every journey begins with courage," she mused, her lips curling into a gentle smile. "And it ends with hope." Apex Air was no longer just an airline. It had become a symbol of integrity, compassion, and resilience. Aaliyah's journey had not only transformed a company, but inspired all who believed in the triumph of truth and justice. Do you believe justice always prevails, or are there unseen shadows in every story? Stay tuned for more captivating tales on our channel. Don't miss out.